Namaste, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sahana Singh, and I am director at Indian History Awareness and Research, or what we call IHAR, which is a Houston-based 501c3 nonprofit organization. But of course, we are deeply rooted in Bharat Mata. And though we are Houston based, our members are from all over the world. We have members in America, India, Europe, Eastern Asia, so on. And I hope the family only gets bigger. So, to tell you about Indian history awareness and research, our vision is to reveal the timelessness of India by, by through its historical narratives. So, as we know, India is quite an enigma. It is there are so many layers to India that the more you uncover, the more there is, the more layers there are below. So that's why our vision is to seek to reveal the timelessness of India. So these narratives that we are trying to find, these matter not just to India, even humanity cannot afford to lose these narratives. As we are seeing even in COVID times, a lot of values, Indic values that have been held so dear are now coming to the fore. All the spirituality, all the going within ourselves, all those things that are very deeply Indic are now coming to the fore. Now, today's topic is India's civilizational impact on Eastern Asia. This is a topic that actually hasn't got as much, it hasn't been researched as much as it should. And in the media coverage also has been quite minimal in mainstream media. And in fact, in the textbooks also in Singapore and the rest of the region, the Indic impact has not been dwelt on in much depth. In fact, the European colonization has been well taught, but the time before that has not been really dwelt upon in the textbooks. And from my personal experience, when I moved to Singapore in 1998, the first thing that struck me, of course, in Singapore was the name Singapura, which was clearly a Sanskrit name. So I was asking myself, was there a Sanskritic civilization here before the colonizers took over? Why is it called Singapura? And I did not really get a very convincing explanation for why it was called Singapura. There was some story about a lion being found there, but why was the lion being called Singa? That itself shows, so what languages were being spoken there? All this was not clear to me. But then as I lived in Singapore for about 15 years and traveled extensively within the region, that is to neighboring Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, all the countries nearby, Indonesia, of course. So, and then I was struck when I went to Malaysia. You have buildings called Surya KLCC. Then you have in Indonesia, language itself is called Bahasa, which is like Bhasha. And then Ramayana, the Ramayana culture is so strong in Indonesia. And who can forget the airport, the Suvarnabhumi airport in Bangkok, where you can see the entire sculpture of Sagara Manthana, Samudra Manthana. There's such a powerful episode in our Puranas, which has been depicted there in the airport, which is called Suvarnabhumi Airport. The whole region is called Suvarnabhumi. So I had a lot of questions about the history of this region, and I knew it was connected to India, but I wasn't very clear about those connections. We were told that traders came from India and they spread the culture. That also seemed a little bit of a shallow explanation. And then when I started researching for my book on India's educational heritage, I wrote a book in 2017. And that's when I came across a lot of interesting facts. For example, that so many of the Chinese scholars who who came to study in India, as we learned, they did not come to India directly. Many of them went to Indonesia, and it was like a preparatory school for them before they tried to get admission into the big universities of India. So Jing and the others went to Indonesia and studied Sanskrit and other allied subjects before they even tried to crack the entrance examinations for Nalanda and the other universities. So that was a very interesting find for me. Now, let me not take too much of time. Today's talk by Sri Prasenjit Basu will throw light on the civilizational connection between India and Eastern Asia. So Prasenjit Basu is a well-known economist and historian. He did his schooling from St. Paul's, Darjeeling, and did BA Economics from St. Stephen's College in Delhi. I also studied in Stephen's for a while, by the way. And he followed it up with a dual master's degrees in international relations and public administration from the University of Pennsylvania. He has worked with many global financial services companies. He has taught at UPenn and at the SP Jain School of Global Management. He's the author of a book titled Asia Reborn. More than a book, I would call it a massive treatise of over 700 pages. It is a very comprehensive book, and it is the only book I know which tells the story of rising Asia from the Asian perspective. We have many books from other perspectives, but this is from the Asian perspective. You should read it. So we are truly honored to have you with us in this webinar, Prasenjit. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Before I hand it over to Prasenjit, I'd like to tell everyone that you are of course watching it on YouTube, so you can type your questions there and I'll keep a watch on them. Prasenjit will speak for about 45 minutes. After that, I will ask your questions. And so the Q&A will last for about 30 minutes. And I'll remind you, Prasenjit, as the time comes closer. So over to you, Prasenjit.
Namaskar. Dhanyavad. Shahana, thank you so much for the introduction. I'll be talking about India's civilizational imprint on East Asia. The way to understand this is that through most of recorded history, India was the world's largest economy. So in the year of Christ's supposed birth, India accounted for 32.9% of world GDP. 1,000 years later, India accounted for 28.9% of world GDP. In the year 1700, India still accounted for 24.4% of world GDP. Throughout that period, India was also the world's largest shipbuilder. And being the world's largest shipbuilder, it naturally was the world's largest trader as well. And so in the period from 0 AD to the first 1,000 years of the so-called Christian era, that was a period of massive trade between India and Southeast Asia, enormous cultural exchanges, educational exchanges, all facilitated by the golden age of the Guptas in the north, east, and west of India, but also by the Satavahanas and the Pallavas from the southern parts of India. All of these were great trading powers, and Sanskrit was the binding civilizational link between India and Southeast Asia. In fact, quite interestingly, Prakrits were gradually replacing Sanskrit as the lingua franca in India proper during that millennium, but Sanskrit became the binding force to create the great civilizations of Southeast Asia. The primary ones were in Cambodia. Of course, there were huge civilizations in Indonesia. Less known is that Vietnam was ruled by a kingdom called the Champa. They ruled from the 2nd century, from precisely 192, the year 192 of the Christian era, all the way up to 1832. Most of southern Vietnam and central Vietnam was ruled by the Champas, who were a Shaivite kingdom, and they ruled for about 1,500 years until the 16th century. In the 16th century, the Champas converted to Islam. And interestingly, Islam came to Southeast Asia from India as well. It was brought by Gujarati traders, Gujarati Muslim traders, who actually brought Islam to Southeast Asia and converted many of the kings of this region. So I'll come to that in a moment. But let me first start with the story of let me try to switch to sharing mode. Are you able to see the slides?
Yes, yes.
Yes?
Yes.
So I'll move on to, so this is it. My topic, of course, is India's civilizational imprint on Eastern Asia. And I'll start with Cambodia. Cambodia had, from the 1st to the 6th century, there were a variety of kingdoms established in Cambodia. They were known as Nokor Phnom. In Chinese, several Chinese visitors to Cambodia referred to this as Funan. But this area called Nokor Phnom traded enormously with the Guptas. And of course, remember that the Guptas, this was the golden age of India, where the Guptas, you had Kalidas writing some of the great plays, Abhigyan, Shakuntala. You had Aryabhatta, who had already measured the circumference of the earth. So if he was measuring the circumference of the earth, he already knew that the earth is round, something that the Europeans discovered 1,000 years later. And then you had Varaha Mihira writing the world's first encyclopedia. And of course, you also had Kama Sutra, the first treatise on human sexuality. So a truly diverse, rich civilization, the Guptas, and they were trading with Cambodia via the Bengal port of Tamralipti, which is a Gupta port. And what is interesting is that when you see the word Nokor, Nokor is actually Nagar. When Nagar reaches Bengal, it becomes Nogor. When it goes further east, it becomes Nokor. So Nokor Phnom is what it was called, but that's actually Nagar. Phnom. Phnom is a local Cambodian word, but actually it means Phnom Nagar. So Nokor Phnom was there from the 1st to the 6th century. Now, what is interesting is that the Cambodians or the Khmers have a founding myth for Nokor Phnom. And the founding myth is that there was a merchant warrior from India called Kaundinya. Kaundinya came to, he was probably from the Pallava region, Pallava ruled region on the east coast of India. And Kaundinya had a battle with a Nokor Phnom princess called Soma. Of course, she had a local name, but in the Indian text, she is known as Soma. And he defeated Soma. Eventually, although he defeated Soma, they fell in love and they got married. And they founded the kingdom that became the main kingdom that became Nokor Phnom, and that ultimately then evolved into the great Khmer Empire. Now, what is also interesting about this is that about 5 generations later, the Pallava king who built the Shore Temple at Mahabalipuram, one of the great products of Pallava architecture, he was actually a Khmer prince who was invited back by the Pallavas from Cambodia because the Pallava king had died and he had no successor. They remembered that there was a cousin who had gone to Cambodia and got married, Cambodia Desh. So they invited him back and he was made the king of the Pallavas. He ruled for 65 years, one of the greatest kings, and he built the Shore Temple. So the Shore Temple was built by perhaps a partly Cambodian king. And of course, there were then multiple Hindu polities that emerged. For some periods, they were subordinate to Mataram and Srivijaya, which I'll talk about, the 2 great Indic kingdoms of what is now Indonesia, Mataram in Java and Srivijaya based in Sumatra and what is now Malaysia. But eventually, the Khmer kingdoms became independent of Mataram and Srivijaya, and from 802 to 1431 was the era of Angkor. They were, of course, Angkor started off as being a Hindu empire, but over time, they subsequent kings were Mahayana Buddhist, but both Buddhists and Hindus were always tolerant of each other. There were, of course, occasional conflicts. For instance, the Chams, the Champa kingdom of what is now Vietnam, and the Cambodians often were at loggerheads. They were both Hindu, but they fought against each other. It wasn't a religious conflict, it was just political conflict. And then, of course, in 1431, Angkor was defeated by an emerging kingdom, which used to be a vassal state of Cambodia. This was Siam. Siam is the old name for what is now called Thailand, but Siam actually means Sham. The Sanskrit Indian word Sham, which means dark, or sometimes referred to as the evening time. So anyway, Sham or Siam was the successor state, and of course, that state still exists. Thailand still exists. So we can draw some conclusions about Cambodia, Khmer, the Khmer Empire, by looking at Thailand, the Kingdom of Thailand as it still exists. So I'll do that with some of my later slides. Then, of course, we move quickly to Indonesia. In Indonesia, there were primarily two great empires to begin with. One was called Mataram, which was Hindu, occasionally Buddhist, but primarily Hindu, based in Java. This was founded by a king called Sanjaya in 732 CE. Sanjaya built the great Prambanan temple complex, which I'll show you in a moment. In the 9th century, some of Sanjaya's successors were called Shailendra, the Shailendra kings, and the Shailendra were Mahayana Buddhists, and they built the great Borobudur complex, which I'll talk to you about as well. Now, separate from Java, so this was Java, and even today, Java is the primary island in the Indonesian archipelago. Java accounts for about 60% of the population of Indonesia, and its roots are deeply Indic. Then, of course, there was another great empire called Srivijaya, which was based in Sumatra. Sumatra is sometimes known as Suvarnabhumi. Many parts of Southeast Asia claim to be Suvarnabhumi. And in fact, of course, Bengal also claimed to be Suvarnabhumi, Sonar Bangla. I mean, we had Rabindranath writing a poem just a century ago, just over a century ago, talking about Sonar Bangla. So Suvarnabhumi, or the golden land, was something that many parts of India and Southeast Asia claim to be. And of course, Thailand today claims that it is still Suvarnabhumi. Now, we have Srivijaya. Srivijaya was Mahayana Buddhist. It was based in Sumatra, and it claimed to be Suvarnabhumi. Among others, one of its smaller ports was called Singapura. And it is interesting that the last Srivijayan prince of Singapura was called Parameswara. And in Parameswara, in the conflicts of that period, lost control of Singapura, and he then gained control of an alternative port and built it up, and that port was Malacca. And as he did that, in the course of doing that, he converted to Islam. He was trading a lot with the Gujarati traders from India, of course, and they converted him to Islam. He went from being Parameshwara to Sikandar Shah in the year 1402, and he ruled there. Now, meanwhile, in Java itself, there were occasional conflicts between Java and between Mataram in Java and Srivijaya. One of these was in the year 1016 CE. In 1016, Srivijaya defeated Mataram, and Mataram was then rallied by the son-in-law of the king of Mataram, who happened to be Balinese. His name was Airlanga. He was a Balinese prince who had married the princess of Mataram. Almost the entire royal family of Mataram had been defeated and killed by Srivijaya. So Airlanga was enthroned in Java, a Balinese prince, and he rallied Mataram, and he is considered to be the greatest. Airlanga is still a hero in Java, the greatest of all kings of Java. And the story of his wedding was made into a great epic poem by the Javanese bard Ampu Kanwa, and it is, guess what it is called? It is called Arjuna Vivaha. So the Mahabharata is so deeply ingrained into Javanese culture that the greatest hero's wedding has to be called Arjuna Vivaha. Anyway, one of his successors, about 200 years later, Kartanegara, was another successor in the dynasty established by Airlanga. He crushed the Chinese navy. The Chinese were then, of course, ruled by Mongols, but the Yuan dynasty navy tried to conquer Java, and Kartanegara defeated and crushed him. And his son-in-law, Radan Vijaya, established a new empire called Majapahit, which became the dominant empire of Java and increasingly of the whole of what is today Indonesia. And of course, Majapahit was always Hindu, and its imprint is still visible in places like Yogyakarta. The current kings of Yogyakarta, who of course only have a ceremonial role, they claim to be descendants of the Majapahit empire. Now, talking about Vietnam, I mentioned the fact that in Vietnam, the Champa Empire ruled from the 2nd century, from 192 CE to 1832. It was Shaivite until its conversion to Islam in the 16th century. Then we have some other interesting cases. In Korea, 10% of the people of Korea claim to be descended from a queen from Ayodhya in India. The queen's name, the Indian name of the queen was Queen Suriratna. She came to Korea in the late 2nd, early 3rd century of the Christian era by boat. It was completely normal for an Indian princess to travel by boat because India was trading with all across Asia. That was completely normal to do that. And today, 10% of Koreans, so all those with the surname Hyo, which is sometimes written as H or H, H-U-R or H-U-H, and a certain type of Kim, the Kims of a city called Gimhae. Gimhae Kims, and all those with the surname Hyo or H are supposed to be descended from Queen Suriratna of Ayodhya. Now, there's actually even some genetic proof that she was of Indian descent. The genetic proof has now been found. But most likely, she was also Pallava. At least her mother was probably Pallava. She may have gone to Ayodhya, and maybe she had a father from Ayodhya, whatever it is. But for now, we have clear evidence that Kim Dae-jung, the so-called Mandela of South Korea, is a Gimhae Kim. So he claimed descent from Queen Suriratna of Ayodhya. And his great political opponent, the founder of the Korean CIA, Kim Jong-pil, was very proud. He always told the Indian ambassadors, I am of Indian descent. I am descended from Ayodhya. And so today there is a relationship between Ayodhya and Gimhae. They are now sister cities, going back to an 1800-year-old civilizational link. Then, of course, we have China. As Shahana mentioned, hundreds of students every year were enrolled in the great universities that the Guptas established. The Guptas established Nalanda. Long before the Guptas, in Takshila, Kanishka had established the great University of Takshila. And after the Guptas, the successors of the Guptas in Eastern India were the Palas. And the Palas had a veritable Ivy League of universities. Not only did they have Nalanda, they established Vikramshila, they had Udantapuri, they had Jagadol. So they had at least 5 great universities, each with about 10,000 students and massive libraries. So I'll show you in a moment photos of Angkor Wat, which was a Khmer version of what was established by the Guptas and the Palas in India. And in fact, you had the Indian educational system was the envy of the known world at the time. And of course, the Chinese used to send. Now, among other things, India also had established a trading colony in Fujian province. And there were mainly Tamils there, mainly from the Pallava region. And the port was called Quanzhou, still exists. If you go to Quanzhou in Fujian province, you will still find evidence of Indian temples, functioning Hindu temples from all that far away that still exist. Then there was an Indian called Gautam, known in China as Kutan Shida, who was the president of China's Board of Astronomy in the 7th century. And so going back even before Nalanda and Takshila, the Qin dynasty emperor of China, Mingdi, invited 2 great Indian scholars called Dharmaraksa and Kashyap Matanga to China in the 1st century of the Christian era. And that is what began the process of interchange, or at least that's the first known interchange between China. Now, what is interesting also is that the very word China is an Indian word for that country. China doesn't call itself China. India used to call China Chin, and from that we get the word China. In fact, the word Mandarin comes from Mantri. Mantri in Indian languages became Mentari by the time it reached the Malay civilizations, Mataram and Srivijaya. They have the term Mentari, and Mentari, when it was taken to China, became Mandarin. So Mandarin is actually again, the word for the English word for the Chinese language, which the Chinese themselves call Putonghua, is called Mandarin in English, but that word Mandarin comes from Mantri. So the links are very deep. Then finally, quickly on Japan. Japan received Buddhism via Korea in the 6th century. But if you think about the links, the very word dhyan became chan when it reached China. And when it reached Japan, the word dhyan became Zen. There are equivalents for many of the Indian gods and goddesses in Japan. So Shiva is Daikokuten, Saraswati is Benzaiten, and Ganeshji is Kangiten. So Shiva's family is fully represented, and in fact, for almost every Indian god and goddess, there is a Japanese equivalent. And finally, the imprint of language. Brahmi became the basis, Pallavi era Brahmi, but also the Brahmis that came from Bengal and Assam, which were the trading regions, and particularly Orissa, or what is then called Utkal. Utkal, Bongo, and Ahom, these three had a huge influence, but also Pallava Brahmi influenced the scripts for Thai. Even today's Thai is written in a script that is Brahmi based. Burmese Khmer, Kavi. Kavi is the mother language for Javanese and Balinese. But if you look at Javanese, Balinese as written today, they are written in a pure Brahmi script. Then further on, in the Philippines, the pre-Spanish Filipino languages were written in a script that is known as Baybayin, and Baybayin is also Brahmi based. Now, then there are languages that were heavily influenced by Sanskrit and Tamil, but where the scripts were different over time. They evolved. So Malay, as spoken in Bahasa Malaysia, is of course a heavily Sanskrit and Tamil influenced language. So for instance, the word kadai is shop in both Tamil and in Malay. You have Swami and Stri, the same in almost all Indic languages, including in Bahasa Malaysia, and so on. And then if you go further on, recent research has revealed that the Maori language of what is now New Zealand was also heavily Sanskrit influenced. And then further, way further east, what the Western world considers its extreme west, Hawaii, the Hawaiian language, is also influenced by Sanskrit. In fact, the last king of independent Hawaii in the 1880s and 1890s was called Kalakaua. I'm not sure that it exactly translates as a black crow, but his name was Kalakaua. So now let me just run you through some examples of the specific influence of Indian art and architecture on Southeast Asia and further east. So I'll start with Cambodia, of course, because Cambodia, a lot of the heritage in Cambodia has been preserved or has been retrieved. In fact, this great temple, the world's largest religious monument, Angkor Wat. By the way, Angkor is Nokor. I told you that Nagar became Nokor, Nogor, Nokor. And further on, the local colloquial version of Nokor was Angkor. So Angkor is actually Nagar. And Wat is the word for temple in both Cambodian and Thai. But actually, if you think about the Sanskrit, Wat means enclosure. So it is basically Angkor Wat is actually a great capital city. It was a great capital city, and it was a massive hydraulic system, some of which still remains. You can see that it was the basis for an enormous irrigation system centered on the capital. But here you have this began as a temple to Vishnu. It was a Vishnu temple established by Suryavarman II, the second Suryavarman, in about the 1120s. Let me show you a few other photos. Now, the central photo here is what used to be in the Sanctum Sanctorum. This is Lord Vishnu. It was, of course, in the Sanctum Sanctorum, but about 150 years after the construction of Angkor Wat, a later king, Jayavarman VII, became a Mahayana Buddhist. So he shifted the Vishnu Murti from the central area to a slightly subordinate position. So the central sanctum now has a grand Buddha Murti, but here you have Vishnu is still in a very prominent position, and this is how you will see Vishnu if you go to Angkor Wat today. He is worshipped on a daily basis there. On the left side of this slide is the central tower of Angkor Wat, and the central tower is basically supposed to represent Mount Meru. On the right-hand side of this slide is a library. There are 4 libraries in Angkor Wat. So just as Nalanda had huge libraries, massive, millions and millions of books in those libraries. In fact, as Shahana pointed out in her book, when Bakhtiyar Khilji burnt down Nalanda, it is supposed to have burnt for as much as 6 months, because there were so many books and palm leaves and so on which enormous amounts of knowledge had been transcribed. So now you get a little bit of a sense of that by looking at this library here. There were 4 such libraries within. You can see those libraries within the Angkor Wat complex even today. Now I'll show you a few other examples of Khmer architecture. This is actually older. These are older than Angkor Wat. In fact, the one in the center is today known as Banti Shrey, which basically means the temple of women, because there's lots of beautiful sculptures of apsaras and devis all around the temple. But when it was originally established, it was established not by a king. It was established by 2 people. One was a scholar, and the other was the grandson of a king who was in trade. So it's a relatively smaller structure, but it's really a very beautiful sandstone structure. And it was originally known as Tribhuvana Maheshwara Temple. So it was, of course, a Shiv temple, and you can still see the Shiv ling there. On the right, I show you another temple which was actually built by a Mahayana Buddhist king, but it is called Ta Prom. Prom means Brahma. In fact, even in Thailand today, if you go to the center of Bangkok, there is a very popular shrine called the Erawan Shrine, the most popular shrine in the capital city of today's Thailand, and it is a shrine to Brahma. And again, that too is called Pra Prom. Pra is the Thai word for God. So they refer to Pra Ram, Pra Sita, Pra Hanuman, and Pra Prom. Prom is Brahma. And it's very well known. When they meet an Indian, they don't say Prom, they say Brahma, because it is, they know that the Sanskrit pronunciation is Brahma. So it is interesting that here you have a Mahayana Buddhist king building a temple that is dedicated to Ta Prom, which is actually Ta means ancestor. So ancestor Brahma. Of course, it's in very bad shape now. There are trees that have grown from the temple, and you can see that here. But the Indian government is actually working with the Cambodian one to try and restore this temple. Then I move on to the royal palace of Cambodia, which still exists. It's a functioning royal palace, although the royal family only uses a very small part of it. Most of it is open to the public. So if you ever go to Phnom Penh, you can see the royal palace and the National Museum. I'll show you 2 slides. This slide here on the left, the left and the central photo are photos of the Ramayana. Along the walls of the royal palace, right across the walls, there are murals showing scenes from the Ramayana. And of course, in Cambodia, the Ramayana is called Riyamakirti. We can easily translate that the kirtis of Ram. Ramayan became Riyamakirti, and the royal name of the kings, the current kings of Cambodia, is Norodom. Norodom is simply Narottam. When we get to Bengal and Orissa, Narottam becomes Norottam. And when it goes further east, it goes from Norottam to Norodom. And that is what there. So Narottam is the top man, and the top man is the king. And so Norodom Sihanook, Norodom Sihamuni is the current king. They still have essentially a Sanskrit-based royal title. And then the Murti you see on the right-hand side of the screen is a Trimurti from the National Museum of Cambodia in Phnom Penh. And if you look at the National Museum, I'd say that about 2/3 of the murtis in the National Museum are Hindu. The other third are Buddhist. Cambodia, of course, now if you talk to tourist guides in Angkor, they'll tell you, oh, at one time we used to be Hindus, now we are Buddhists. But the Hindu way was the old way. But in fact, I'll show you in a moment that the practice of faith and religion is actually completely malleable, and Hindu gods are, in fact, or were respected just as much in so-called Buddhist countries, including Thailand. So I'll come to that in a second. But now these are 3 more images from the National Museum in Phnom Penh. The one in the center is a shivling, and the shivling stands as the most prominent display in the garden at the entrance of the National Museum. So anybody entering the National Museum passes the shivling, and you can worship there and then enter the National Museum. And here I've shown Lord Shiva's 2 children, Ganesh and Lakshmi, 2 of the children. And then, of course, there's Saraswati, and you find lots and lots. But on the left, this is a representation of Lakshmi. She looks quite different from any representation of Lakshmi that we have in India, but each civilization has its own interpretation of the cultural legacy. But of course, Ganesh ji can never be, you can always recognize Ganesh ji. Now, because the kingdom of Cambodia was re-established during and after the French were removed from Cambodia, some of the cultural legacy remains. So this is one of the minor temples in Angkor Thom, and here I witnessed some marvelous reenactment of the Ramayana with of course Hanumanji and everything else, shortened into a 1.5 hour performance. So these are some scenes of it before that began. So Khmer temples are in fact still very effectively used for contemporary cultural performances, and you see that to some degree in some of the temples in Indonesia and of course in Thailand as well. Now, Thailand, just a quick. Now, the interesting thing is, I mentioned the fact that Siam or Thailand ended the Angkor Empire. They were a vassal state. The Sukhothai Empire, kingdom of Thailand were a vassal state of the Angkor, but in the year 1431, and in fact by about 1375, they gradually became more and more independent, and then they defeated the Angkor Empire and established their own. And the conflict between Thailand and Cambodia continues. They still have disputes over which temple, there's a famous Hindu temple called the Priya Vihar temple, which is on the border. And of course, during the Second World War, large part, about 1/3 of Cambodia became part of Thailand, and it was taken back, etc. So there's this conflict. But the interesting thing about the Indic links, here, this is on the top. The top frieze shows you the temple of the Emerald Buddha, the most prominent Wat in Bangkok. The temple of the Emerald Buddha, Wat Kiao Pra, if I can remember the pronunciation, something like that. But the temple of the Emerald Buddha, and you can't see it that clearly in this photo, but this is a representation. All along its walls are representations of the Ramayana. In Thailand, the Ramayana is known as Ramakien, and they consider it their national epic to such an extent that the kings of the current dynasty of Thailand are called Ram. So the temple of the Emerald Buddha was actually built by King Rama I. King Rama I built this. He's the first king of the Chakri dynasty. He built this soon after becoming the king of the Thais, and he wanted to express his devotion to his legacy by building a great temple to Emerald Buddha. But along its walls, of course, he had the national epic, the Ramakien, in murals. The photo at the bottom is a contemporary photo of the Erawan Shrine, the most popular shrine in Thailand. And in fact, I show, you see Thai people. Every Thai person who passes the Erawan Shrine stops and prays. At a minimum, they pray, and they normally offer vibhuti, and they do their dhoop offering, as you can see with the lady here in a maroon shirt. This is a shrine to Pram, that is to Brahma. And of course, nobody thinks twice. No Thai person thinks twice that, oh, why am I stopping at a Hindu shrine? It is a shrine to their god, and hence they stop at the shrine and pray. And that to me is a true representation of Indic civilization. Indic civilization was always open to differences in faith and differences in the way you worship God, and that Bhagavan, Ishwar, Maheshwar, Buddha, the Allah, whichever way you want to put it, is acceptable in the Indic way. Now, I move on now to some of the Indonesian cases. And here, I start with this great, the Prambanan Trimurti Mandir in Java. This is in central East Java, quite close to Yogyakarta. This, of course, was built by Sanjaya himself, the first king of Mataram. Built this enormous complex. It's a Trimurti Mandir, but as you can see, there are more than three temple towers. So the largest one in the center is, of course, a Shiv Mandir. Then on the side, there's a Vishnu and a Brahma Mandir, and there are mandirs for each of the Vahans of the Trimurti as well. And there are smaller mandirs for the children of Shiv. There's a Durga Mandir, there's a Ganesh Mandir. There are sort of variety of different mandirs built in the 8th century in Prambanan. And here you can see me standing at the Vishnu, in front of the Vishnu Mandir. And on the right, there are some sculptural details. If I can show you, I can enlarge that. You can see that some beautiful sculpture there. I should not have done that. I might have to. Okay, how do I go? All right, so that's Prambanan, and then I show you Borobudur. the world's largest Buddhist monument, built in the 10th century of the Christian era, for want of a better term, Christian era, AD or CE. In the center, I show you a side view of Borobudur. In each of the alcoves, there is a Buddha, and in fact, there are hundreds of Buddhas in each of the alcoves that you can see, and each of the stupa-like structures contains a Buddha inside. So in some of the stupas, they have removed, if you look at the photo on the right, my wife is standing next to, my wife Aarti is standing next to the Lord Buddha in one of those stupas which has been opened up. Otherwise, you have to look through these gaps in the stone to find Buddha inside. Now, on the left, I am seated next to a very interesting piece of sculpture, which shows a ship. This is, everybody there, all guides will tell you, this is an Indian ship. So the fact that India and Indonesia used to trade is evident here. I mean, the most natural thing for Indians to do is to trade. And then next to it is our Jataka tales. Of course, those are the great Buddhist tales. But the fact that there is a clear Indic link is something that is celebrated in this piece of sculpture. And then we have another place in Indonesia where the spiritual links to India remain live today. And that, of course, is Bali. Anybody who goes to Bali, as soon as you arrive at Denpasar Airport, as you leave Denpasar Airport, the first thing you find is a magnificent statue. And if you ask your driver, they are guaranteed to know what that statue is. That is called Ghatotkacha Sarai. Bhim is very popular in Bali, and Bhim's son through Hidimba, Ghatotkacha, is extremely popular all over Indonesia, particularly in Bali and Java. I mentioned at the outset that the greatest Javanese king was actually Balinese. Airlangga, the greatest Javanese king, the one who had that Arjuna Vivaha, which is the national epic of Indonesia, he was Balinese. So Bali had a tremendous spiritual impact also on Java. But in the year 1527, the king of Majapahit, based in Yogyakarta, converted to Islam. And earlier, in the previous 30 or 40 years, various coastal kings and rulers had converted to Islam as well. And Islam, again, came to Indonesia as an Indian import. It was primarily Sufi Islam, where the spiritual aspect of Islam is emphasized, and that is what became the basis through which conversions happened. So 1527, the year after the first battle of Panipat in India. So that is when it happened. Now, by that time, the Dutch and the Portuguese, particularly the Portuguese, were already roaming all over this region. In fact, the Portuguese conquered conquered Malacca in what is now Malaysia in the year 1511. And one of the generals who fought for the Portuguese in Malacca was a man called Magellan. And in fact, Magellan got very badly injured. And when he went back, the Portuguese king sort of looked down upon him for being lame, and he had got badly injured. His eye, he looked really ugly. So the Portuguese king dismissed him for his efforts in conquering Malacca. Instead, Magellan turned to Spain, and the Spanish king funded his journey. And Magellan, of course, is supposed to be the first European to circumnavigate the earth. I'll come to that in a moment. Before I do that, let me just quickly tell you what these three statues. These are very modern statues. As you can see, the one on the left is a statue in a square, just a normal square in the town of Ubud in Bali. This shows Arjun. The one in the middle is Sri Krishna. And this is in a town square in another town in Bali called Sanur. So Ubud and Sanur, you have Arjun and Sri Krishna. But if you go to Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, right in front of Bank Indonesia, one of the most prominent squares in the capital city of Indonesia, there is a statue called the Arjuna Vijaya statue, with Arjuna getting ready to fight the battle of Kurukshetra and Sri Krishna behind him. This is right in front. It's a massive statue, the most prominent statue in Indonesia. It is the national monument right in front of the Bank Indonesia building. As an economist, I go there quite frequently, so I am very, very proud to see that beautiful building, and all Indonesians are extremely proud of that as a national symbol. So the cultural influence remains, although the religious influence has faded. And then the other statue you see here is a statue of Saraswati. And Saraswati, there's a statue of Saraswati in every Balinese school. Schools are called sekolah, like in Malaysia, and every sekolah has a Saraswati statue. This particular Saraswati statue is in front of the sekolah that stands outside the Ubud Puri, that is the palace of the last king of Ubud. By the way, the so-called kings that exist in Bali today are quite minor kings, because Bali never fell to any sort of Islamic influence. And Bali was the last island in what is now Indonesia to be conquered by a European power. Bali was conquered by the Dutch in the year 1908, just 112 years ago. And when it was conquered, the entire elite of Bali committed ritual suicide. It was called puputan, and they all committed ritual suicide. So about 20,000 members of the elite of Bali died in this sort of almost a form of jauhar, or puputan, that they committed, because they found that they were unable to resist the guns of Dutch. And then finally, I come to two countries where the Indian imprint was largely wiped out through military defeat. Champa, as I said, was ruled by Champa was a great Hindu kingdom that started in 192 CE, and that lasted all the way until the year 1832. But in the year 1471, Champa was defeated by a people from the north of Vietnam called the Zai Viet. And the people who now are the majority community of Vietnam are descendants of the Zai Viet. So today, the Chams are a small minority community, and most Chams are actually Muslim. There's a very small community of about 50,000 Chams who are called Balamon Cham, who basically, Balamon is their way of saying Brahman. Brahmin Cham have remained Hindu, but it's a very small community. Most of the Cham, now after 1471, after the defeat by the Zai Viet, the Cham were divided into 2 or 3 little kingdoms. They were deeply weakened by that military defeat. But what is interesting is that the great cities that the Champa Empire was based on all had beautiful Sanskrit names, like Pandurang. Pandurang was one of the great cities. The capital city was called Indrapura. Throughout, and of course, just as the kings of Cambodia had names ending in Varman, so did the kings of the Champa generally have names ending in Varman. Now, of course, in India today, if you think about Tripura, about 10% of the 10 to 15% of the Tripuri people are called Varman, including SD Burman is actually SD Varman, is a Tripuri, RD Burman, and Somdev Dev Varman, the best Indian tennis player of the 21st century, male, they're all Tripuri. They all have the name Varman. So just as the Tripura's kings are called Varman, similarly the kings of Champa in Vietnam were known as something Varman throughout their 1700 years or 1650 years as kings in Vietnam. So the temple on the left that I show you here, these are all in ruins. The ruins have been somehow restored. This is one of the best restored so-called ruins. This is, of course, this is a Durga temple. But what is interesting is that Durga had a local name, and it is known by its local name. And of course, the right is a dancing Shiva movie. Now, so I showed you Vietnam is a case where the Indic influence was deep, but the Indic civilization was defeated, and it no longer has a significance to most of the majority community in Vietnam. Much worse, of course, is the fate of the Indic influence in the Philippines. And I talked about Magellan. Now, Magellan, 499 years ago, Ferdinand Magellan was killed by the person that you see on the left of the screen. And if you really look carefully, he's wearing what looks like a dhoti. His name is Sri Lapu-Lapu, and he was the ruler of the island of Mactan, which is off Cebu. On the right-hand side, with the body paint, is the Raja of Cebu in 1520, 1521. He was a Chola. He was a Chola Raja. Now, what happened? How did the Cholas land up here? Now, in the year 1025, the kings of both Java and Angkor invited Rajendra Chola to invade Srivijaya. This is the only known example of an Indian kingdom in actually militarily invading Southeast Asia. And so Rajendra Chola, by the way, had just defeated Mahipal, the king of Bengal. And he was not only the king of Bengal, he was also the king of what is today Bihar, Magad, and Banaras. So the Palas ruled most of eastern India from Bengal, and Mahipal was defeated by Rajendra Chola, and Rajendra Chola then called himself Gangai Konda because he brought back water from the Ganga in Banaras, and he announced that he had completed the Ashwamedha Yagna, and he was now Gangai Konda. He was Gangai Konda Chola, and his capital city was renamed Gangai Konda Cholapuram. But that same Gangai Konda Cholapuram also took his navy to Srivijaya's capital, and he conquered Srivijaya and then conquered the northern territories of Srivijaya in what is now called Kedah state in Malaysia, then known as Kadaram. Kadaram was also conquered by Rajendra Chola. And that is why perhaps we have so many Tamil words in Malay today. But the Cholas, then after Rajendra Chola's conquest, he went back to his Tamil territories, and of course he ruled much of southern India, and the Cholas remained a very potent force for the whole 2,000-year period. But the influence of the Cholas remained, and subsequently many of the minor kings of the entire archipelago that constitutes Indonesia and the Philippines, many of them were Cholas. So this person you see, the body paint, his name is, he was a Chola Raja, and his name was he was in the Filipino languages, in Visayas, he was known as Humabon, and he was a Chola Raja. Now, the third image that you see on this, the central image, is an image of Matara. This was found in the southern part of the Philippines in a place called Butuan. Butuan is known to have had a Hindu monarchy for about 800 years. So this Butuan, Cebu, where Humabon ruled, and a king and another Hindu kingdom in what is now Kalimantan. These were the three remaining Hindu kingdoms that were still there when Magellan arrived in the Philippines. By then, 1520, Majapahit was in its last few years before the conversion to Islam. But there were these three other great Hindu kingdoms that remained. Humabon was converted by Magellan to Christianity, and he became Don Carlos, and his wife, who also had a Humabon type name, probably in Indian queen name, also was converted, and 800 of their people were converted to Christianity. And so in the Philippines today, the Indic influence is almost zero. There's nothing left, except that they know that the Baybayin script is of Indic influence, and they discovered this Matara. Now, this Matara is an interesting story. This is a 9th century pure gold murti of Matara, most likely of Durga or Kali. And the local people in the area, in Butuan, they still talk of their own gods and goddesses as devatas. Devatas, slight variant of devata, what they say, devata. So this Matara was known to be a devata. So they also refer to the animal spirits that they still worship as devatas. Now, according to the most Western scholars, devata is just the local word. But most people realize that if they are calling animal spirits devatas, then obviously they are forms of proto-Hinduism, and the Indic influence there remained, although in a very, very mild form, because most of the Philippines, of course, converted to Christianity. And of course, there's a small region in Mindanao, which is Muslim. But the Hindu influence on the Philippines has been entirely wiped out, except for the slight memory of Sri Lapu-Lapu. And in fact, it is possible that Sri Lapu-Lapu was verging towards Islam as well by that point. He certainly was also a Chola to start with, but the point is, they were of Indic influence. The Indic influence remains. And as you go further east, you find lots of other influences as well. So I'm about to pause now. Before I do that, just of course, I'll talk a little bit about the Koreans. So you had the Korean princess called Hyo Hwang-ok. The Korean name is Hyo Hwang-ok, and Her Sanskrit name, of course, was Suriratna. Most likely, she was of Pallava descent, but she's known to have been a princess of Ayodhya, who probably took a boat down the Ganga and got onto another ship in Tamralipti and set off. This was the Gupta period, after all, early Gupta period, and set off to Korea and married Gyumgang Gaya. The king of Gyumgang Gaya was called King Suro. So they had 12 children. 10 of them had the surname Kim. So the Gimhe Kims are supposed to be descended from those 10 sons. 2 sons, she requested that 2 of the sons should maintain her surname, and they are the Hyo or the Her. People in Korea with the surname Hyo and Her. So the founder of LG, Lucky Goldstar, the great consumer electronics conglomerate of Korea, was a Hyo. So a descendant of Queen Suriratna, and of course Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-pil, the liberal and the anti-liberal conservative political leaders, and several others. In fact, the current president, his wife is a Gimhe Kim as well. So a very large number of Koreans claim Indian descent, and so that is a living legacy of sorts. And of course, the other living legacy is through Buddhism. If you go to any of the temples of Korea, Korea is one of the few countries in East Asia that has embraced Christianity over the past century or so. But slight majority of people in Korea are now Christian. But if you go to the Buddhist monasteries, then the Indic influence is pervasive. And of course, if you go to any Buddhist museum, Buddhist temple, you'll find maps of India with all the major pilgrimage sites marked out. And similarly, if you go to, say, the Kiyomizu temple in Kyoto, the great, at the top of the city of Kyoto is the Kiyomizu temple, and it is a beautiful place where the Indic influence is deep. But of course, it is in the form primarily of Buddhism. There are smaller shrines to Daikoten and Kaizeten and so on, the Shiva, Saraswati, Lakshmi, Ganesh. So the influence remains deep, and I think it is something that India really needs to tap into much more than it has done during the past. Now, it's quite interesting. Shahana ji referred at the beginning to the colonial influence. For the Britishers to acknowledge India's enormous civilizational heritage would be to undermine the ideological basis of empire. So, in the year 1817, a man called James Mill wrote a book called The History of British India, where that became essentially I'd say the Mahabharata for the Britishers in India. And what it tried to do was it tried to say that the Indians had no past history of any significance, and unfortunately, many in India bought into this nonsense. We Macaulay Putras were fed this nonsense through the British period, and some of our great historians unfortunately bought into it as well. But as we now rediscover, now if you read R.C. Majumdar, he bought into many of the ideological bases of the British, but he also had his eyes, and the eyes showed him that East Asia was an area that had pervasive Indian and Indic influence. And so he wrote the first modern book by an Indian on India's influence and imprint on East Asia. Before that, of course, it was the French, a man called Ravages, who had written the first major book on the Indic influence. And actually, ironically, if you read Nehru's Glimpses of World History, he acknowledges it there as well. In fact, he goes to the extent of calling it Greater India, which I think is a slight misnomer. When Mao Zedong met Nixon in 1971 and 72, he cited Nehru talking about Greater India. And he basically said, look, this man Nehru is an imperialist. It is really ironic because Nehru had been talking about Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai right from the beginning, and he let China take control of our eternal neighbor, Tibet. Now, Tibet, in the year 781, the Tibetan Empire defeated the Chinese in a war, and this was the Battle of Talas in 781, that is in the 8th century CE. So, and throughout, Tibet was our neighbor. In fact, Tibetan Buddhism is deeply influenced by the tantric beliefs of Bengal and Orissa. Vajrayana Buddhism, as it's called in Tibet, is deeply tantric. And of course, I didn't talk too much about Tibet and Sri Lanka because they are very much part of our neighborhood. The Burmese kings, if you think about the Burmese kings, they were coronated in exactly the same way as the Thai kings are coronated today. When a Thai king is coronated, we just had the coronation a year ago. And the coronation of a Thai king has to be done with the Ganga Jal from Banaras, from Varanasi, nowhere else. It has to come from the most sacred ancient city established by Lord Shiva in ancient times, and nowhere else. And you must have 10 Brahmins who are brought from Banaras, and you have to have 10 white Brahmini cows. And then, of course, nowadays the current king requested that holy water be brought also from all the Thai rivers. But the holiest river for the Thais is still Ganga. And the personal religious faith of the royal family of Thailand still is Shaivite. And the king, Rama X's sister, is a Sanskrit scholar, and she is one of the custodians of that legacy. So we still have a live legacy in many parts of this region. And I think we need to cultivate and develop and deepen those relationships in order to foster greater civilizational and cultural ties and build an Indic and Asian narrative for the future of humanity. Thank you very much for listening. Namaskar. Bande Mataram.
Thank you, Prasenjit. That was wonderful. Would you mind stopping to share your screen so that we can see you fully?
Oh, okay. So
yes, it was an
let me say Namaskar and Bande Mataram. I thought I had forgotten that I was sharing the presentation still. Yes, so here we are. Yeah.
No, thank you so much.
Open now to questions, please.
Yes. Yes, you painted a beautiful canvas for us, and we could literally see the vibrant relations between India and Eastern India. It was Eastern Asia. It was amazing. So actually, there are a lot of questions pouring in on YouTube, but so let me see how to take the questions. What I'll do is I'll take the first question from Ayon Ghosh, because he sent it to me long before your talk, and he wanted those questions to be answered. So he's asking, how is it that though the Chinese were the political hegemons of Southeast Asia after the fall of Cholas, it was the Indic civilization that flourished right up to Vietnam, which was next door to China? So that is Oyon's question.
Very interesting question. And first of all, the Zai Viet in northern Vietnam were constantly in conflict with the Chinese. So if you think about China's concept of kingship, it is based on the idea that China is the middle kingdom and everybody else is a tributary state of China. Now, what is interesting is that India was always left out of this idea of tributary states. China has never claimed until recent times, until the Mao dynasty, China has never claimed that India can be a tributary state. India was called the noble realm, but India was never included as a tributary state. But what basically happened was that many countries that traded with China sent gifts. Now, when the gift arrived in Beijing, it was considered to be a tribute, and the Chinese sent some gift back, but the gift was of lesser importance. So now, if you look at Vietnam, the Zai Viet were always in conflict with the Chinese, and the Chinese claimed that Zai Viet is a vassal state of the Middle Kingdom. But in fact, through most of history, China, as it now exists, did not exist as a full nation state or civilizational state. So, for instance, now it is important to understand that the Mongols were the first dynasty to actually rule most of what today is considered China. And the Mongols were not Chinese at all. They were Mongolian. Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, became the emperor of China. One of Genghis Khan's grandsons became the emperor of Persia, and a descendant became the emperor of India. We call them Mughals, but Babur was only, from his mother's side, he was a Chagtai Mongol. From his father's side, he was a descendant of Timur the Lame, Timurlang. And so they considered themselves Timurid rather than Mughal. But since the Mongols had tried to conquer India many times, they came to be known popularly in India as Mughals. Now, similarly, the Mongol dynasty, who were Buddhist, by the way, the Mongols were originally Buddhist. Some Mongols became Muslim after they conquered Persia and Baghdad. That is in the 13th century. They chose to embrace Shia Islam. But the original Mongols were shaman. They had shamanistic beliefs, which were proto-Hindu, and then they were Buddhist. Kublai Khan was a Buddhist. So it was Kublai Khan who first united all that is now China, southern China and northern China. There were two, the Sung dynasty, northern Sung and the southern Sung. They were separate. They were fighting each other all the time. And the northern Sung were fighting the Mongols and the Jurchens. The Jurchens were a predecessor to the Manchus, who eventually conquered China. So there was no real China of this size until the Mongols came along. And so, of course, the China that existed was around Shandong province and Beijing and a few areas in the north of the country. So the Great Wall of China was built where the border of China was. You go to Great Wall, is very close to Beijing, it's not very far from Beijing. So it wasn't as if China was this huge empire throughout history. It was actually quite a small little place. And they claimed tribute from the Koreans. Ask the Koreans. When Xi Jinping met Trump, he whispered in his ear that whole of Korea used to be part of China. And the next thing after the meeting, Trump tweeted, "Oh, did you know that the whole of Korea was part of China?" This is a nonsensical claim. You ask the Koreans will say that Jilin province and most of Manchuria was part of Korea. The Koguryo ruled Korea. So I think this now, similarly, just as they were trying to claim Korea, they were always claiming North Vietnam. But the Indic civilization still was the dominant one in central Vietnam and southern Vietnam. And because of the links to the Khmer, now, of course, they were often fighting the Khmer, but they had a close civilizational link. Plus, there was Java. So that entire region had an Indic legacy that enabled them to stay relatively united and strong. And not just that. I mean, there was Kutai in Kalimantan, as well as I point to Cebu and Butuan. So the entire archipelago of Indonesia and the Philippines was Hindu and Indic, occasionally Buddhist, Mahayana Buddhist, but belonging to the same cultural sphere. And so it wasn't that easy for China to exert. Now, there's also an interesting case. Now, one time, China did invade one of these countries. The Manchus. Manchus, of course, were also Buddhist. And they came from the north of what is now China, northeastern part, Jilin, Heilongjiang, and Liaoning provinces. Now, when the Manchus, you see, in the 1760s, Burma invaded Thailand. Thailand's capital was then called Ayodhya. Ayutthaya, they call it. Ayutthaya. Ayutthaya was Ayodhya, of course. This was before the Chakri dynasty. And the Thais were defeated by the Burmese. And then it seemed as if the Burmese would control Thailand. But when the Burmese went back to Burma, they were attacked by the Manchus from China. But the Manchus came wearing felt boots because they were from north, from the Arctic, I mean, from the steppes of the north. So they were wearing, and they were defeated by the Burmese. But because the Manchus had tried to conquer Burma, they could not keep control of Thailand, and so Thailand re-established its independence. Their main capital city, Ayodhya, was utterly destroyed. They established a new one in what is now Bangkok, the Chakri dynasty. But so there was a dynamic in this region that was there, and the dynamic was based on an Indic legacy, which is what kept I think all of these empires together and separate from China. Now, what is interesting is that the current kings of Thailand actually came to Thailand from what is now Yunnan province of China. So you'll find many European scholars saying that the kings of Thailand are actually Chinese. This is nonsense, because Yunnan, the people of Yunnan were called Dai or Thai. And in fact, some of the Dai migrated to what is now Assam. The Ahom people are Thai people. They are of Thai descent. And so the Ahom, the Shan of the eastern part of Burma, the Laotians, and the Thais are all ethnically very similar. They all came from what is now Yunnan province. But Yunnan province was Dai. Most of the people were Dai or Thai, majority, and they were Buddhist. So they were Indic influenced. So if you go to Yunnan province, there are still lots of signs of the Indic influence there. And Yunnan province was part of the great Tibetan Empire in the 8th century, which defeated the Tang dynasty. So to say that something is Chinese is a bit of a misnomer, because what we think of as China today is a vast expansion of what was China through most of history.
Thank you, Prasenjit. Your answers are very illuminating, and I've come to know a lot of new things from you. So the next question was from Arno Bhattacharya. Again, he sent it to me. I'll ask that before I go to the live chat questions. So he talked about the rituals performed during birth, marriage, and death which often tell you a great deal about the civilizational moorings of a region. So he's asking, what similarities do you see in this regard?
Those similarities continue to exist. Now, so I'll give you an example of Malaysia, right? Malaysia is a deeply Muslim country, and the difference between Malaysian Islam and Indonesian Islam are quite significant. In Indonesia, of course, there's diversity. Javanese Islam is a lighter form of Islam, more of the Sufi influence, with a lot of Hindu and Buddhist influence, as well as animism, part of the way an Abangan Muslim in Java practices his faith. So that's a lighter form of Islam. Islam in Malaysia was much more influenced by Aceh. Aceh was the first kingdom in Sumatra to convert to Islam, and the Acehnese are still extremely orthodox in their practice of Islam, and so are the Muslims of Malaysia. Malaysia is a very orthodox Muslim country, much more so than Javanese particularly, but Indonesia in general, other than Aceh. Now, in Malaysia, the marriage ceremony has all the Hindu elements, the mala badal, everything. It's the going around 7 times together, except the fire is missing. The fire is missing. Of course, they recognize that the fire was the sacred aspect that needs to go, but otherwise, the cultural legacy remains. Similarly, when if you watched the prime minister being sworn in, when Mahathir was sworn in 2018. By the way, Mahathir, his own name is pretty interesting. Mahathir is quite an Indian name, but the longest serving prime minister of Malaysia is actually Mahathir bin Muhammad Kutty. His grandfather was from Kerala. But that aside, the marriage, the wedding ceremony has all the Indic elements. And when a prime minister is taking his oath, the king sits on the Singhasan. The king is sitting on the Singhasan, and so the old Sanskrit words are still deeply within. And of course, the king is called Raja. He's a Raja, Raja Muda is the Malay word for son. So crown prince is Raja Muda.
I myself saw something like an Upanayan ceremony that they have
yes.
in Myanmar, right? And they have pictures of the time the child starts its education.
So, yes, so they have so the cultural legacy has remained, as it has, of course, in places like Thailand, Cambodia, etc. Right. Now, of course, in places like Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, it's really interesting to see that the people are extremely devout. In Laos, I saw this particularly. If you go to Luang Prabang, the old capital of the royal capital of Laos, the devotion, the deep devotion of the common people is there to see. Of course, it's devotion to Buddhism. They're deeply Buddhist, but Laos became communist. Extraordinarily, immediately after the Second World War, even King Norodom Sihanouk became some form of communist. In Laos, you had 3 princes, a Raja and 2 Uparajas. They're called Uparaja. Raja and 2 Uparajas were the leaders of the 3 parties of communism. One was the leader of the Socialist Party, one was the leader of the Communist Party, and one was the leader of the Maoist Party. 3 Rajas and Uparajas leading the various communist movements. It is completely against the grain of their legacy. Communism has zero to do with the way a Laotian wants to live his life. And you see it, they voluntarily join the monasteries, they become monks voluntarily. And that is the the path to upward mobility traditionally for the common people of Laos and Thailand and to some degree Vietnam. But that is all being washed away by the attempt at imposing a Western philosophy of Marxism. Marx did not understand a thing about Asia, but he became so incredibly popular among the intellectual elites of this region.
So I don't think I'll be able to take all the questions pouring in on YouTube. You're getting a lot of appreciation for your talk. They're all waiting for the recording. One thing that Rohan Agarwal from Tokyo is pointing out is that it is not entirely due to Buddha that there is an Indic influence in Japan. Long before Buddhism went there, Indic deities were being worshipped there. So he points out that.
Very true. And you see, now the point is that the traditional Zen, well, pre-Zen, the traditional religions of Japan were definitely deeply influenced by India. Now, the other interesting aspect is that in Japan, until 20 years after the Meiji Restoration, until 1888, the Japanese did not eat beef. Beef eating was introduced into the Japanese diet 20 years after the Meiji Restoration, because Japan was trying to adopt various aspects of the West. They were trying to understand why the West had become so strong so quickly. And one of the things they decided was important was that they must start eating beef. And that is why the Europeans are so tall and strong. And so we must eat beef. So they began to eat beef only 20 years after the Meiji Restoration. Before that, the Japanese diet was primarily vegetarian and fishitarian. They used to eat fish. Of course, as anybody who goes to the Tsukiji market in Tokyo knows that fish eating is deeply culturally ingrained in Japan. Beef eating is new. It only started in 1888. And in fact, I discovered that most Buddhists in Singapore, when I went to Singapore for the first time in 27 years ago, Buddhism was the majority religion of Singapore. About 57% were Buddhists. I think now it is slightly below 50. It is still the plurality religion, not the majority anymore. But Buddhists in Singapore don't eat beef. So there is, we think of Buddhists as being vegetarian, but in Tibet, Buddhists eat beef, our neighboring country, because there's nothing else. In Tibet, very little grain grows. So they have to eat flesh. And so when Buddhism reached Tibet, they had to adopt that. But in most of East Asia, the Buddhist does not eat beef. And in Japan, the other interesting aspect is that Japan had a caste system, which is rather similar to the Indian caste system. They even had an untouchable caste. They called them Burakumin. And the Burakumin system was only abolished about 100 years ago. And that initial abolition didn't work too well. So there's a part of Tokyo that is known as the Burakumin area. And then there was, of course, the samurai were the equivalent of the Kshatriyas. The elite were the equivalent of the Brahmins, the aristocratic elite. And then there was the merchant community. And the merchant community gradually became more powerful than the samurai. So after the Meiji Restoration, samurai merchant relations began to change.
Of course, but the point is
that there was a caste system. So there's a lot of, now, see, there are many aspects of the legacy that are not fully understood, not fully explored. They need to be explored in more detail, and they hopefully will be. But some of the great thinkers in Japan saw that Japan was greatly influenced by the two great civilizations of Asia, that of China and India, and so Tokyo University introduced Sanskrit studies in the year 1900. In many universities in India, we don't have Sanskrit studies today.
I just want to add that the caste system is more of a European interpretation of our Varna Jati system, needs a bit more study. So I suppose
absolutely.
that needs to be done in Japan as well. So I'm looking at the comments again on YouTube, and there is a question. Are there any projects currently being conducted to understand the cultural and linguistic links better? Do you know of projects?
Well, I don't know of any projects. Frankly, there are a few places in India which do some study of East Asia. I know that Delhi University now has an East Asian Studies department, but it didn't in the past. It has one now. So there are JNU has. Now the problem with a lot of these is that what they will study is from a Marxist perspective rather than from a cultural and linguistic perspective, and so they'll miss many of the deep nuances that need to be studied and built upon. But Bali, for instance, just in the past year, Bali has now got its own Hindu university, and in Bali there are many attempts to establish links to Indian academics who are of a similar bent, but it's really difficult to find. There aren't enough people in India who have been deeply engaged in this. So mine is an amateur effort. Frankly, mine is just an amateur effort aimed at establishing these links that I see with my own eyes. You see it so clearly, and then you notice the links that emerge. The cultural, the linguistic links are so deep that you have to begin to look at them, and then but I think what I'm trying to do, what my friend Sanjeev Sanyal has done with his great book Ocean of Churn, and these are amateur attempts at creating the groundwork for more intense deep dive studies.
Thank you. I think there's also work for IHAR to do here, perhaps.
Very much.
Right. And so there are lots of comments. There is one from Surendra Singh Bishji, who's asking, he's saying the people of Philippines, when they wrote their constitution, they remembered Manu and put Manu's portrait in their assembly. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, I've seen that. Well, they not only that, but the old name for the Philippines, one of the old names of the Philippines is Maharlika. Maharlika is actually Mahalinga. So the current President Duterte, was looking around. The most popular rice in the Philippines is called Maharlika rice, and he thought that this was the old name for the Philippines. Why don't we change? The Philippines is the only country in the world that is named after the prince of another country. The Philippines is named after King Philip II of Spain. He was Crown Prince Philip when Magellan arrived in the Philippines. So it's ridiculous that the country should be called, should be named after a foreign prince. So they have thought of many names. One of the names was Maharlika, which is actually Mahalinga. Now, then of course someone pointed out, someone misinterpreted the meaning of linga and all that, and so then it died out. But the point is that the Indic influence is deep. It is in the language, and since the language has the Indic influence, and the script, the old script, which hardly anybody knows. I'd say less than 0.05% of Filipinos know the Baybayin script, except a few historians, and even the historians. One of the leading historians wrote an article about this Tara of Agusan, which is the Tara of Agusan is there in the Chicago Field Museum. So he went to Chicago and he wrote about it. but his knowledge of it was so shallow that it was really a little disappointing. He's one of the leading historians of the Philippines. He wrote in the newspaper, but it was a very, very shallow understanding. So I wrote to him. He did not write back, unfortunately, but maybe I'll try harder to establish links and maybe engage in more discussion.
Okay. So just one more question, and after that, I will request Subrotoji, our president, to wrap up and give us some closing remarks. So there's a question from some people about were there any forceful conversions to Islam? Such things like the royal family being forcefully converted, or the people being forcefully converted. Was it all like people? The impression being given is that everybody, the Islam came very peacefully. But do you think there were any forceful conversions, whether to Islam or Christianity or any other religion?
Of course, there were forceful conversions, no doubt. But now there were the initial. Now, so for instance, the Archanis were proselytizers. So they tried to forcefully convert. And when Islam came to Java, there was a little bit of force for sure. It wasn't all just the king being convinced and then. But in Java, the conversion, there wasn't that much of a formal conversion. It was all very informal, particularly in Central and East Java. It was quite informal. In West Java, there was much more. There was war fighting. Religious wars were fought in West Java. Lots of religious wars occurred in Sumatra. In Sumatra, there is a matrilineal community in Sumatra, and in the 1830s, there was an attempt. There's something called the Padri Rebellion. Padri Rebellion, when people had gone to study at Al-Azhar University in Egypt, and they had learned about the Wahhabi forms of Islam. And they came back. So there was intra-Islamic conflict as well. So they were trying to convert this matrilineal Muslim community to Wahhabism, which was ultra-Orthodox form of Islam, the opposite of matrilineal. Right. And so there was tremendous conflict over that. So there was intra-Islamic conflict as well. And of course, forceful conversions, particularly by the Christians for sure. There was a lot of force used across the Philippines in places like Ambon and Ternate, the first areas that the Portuguese arrived in. You have to realize that Pope Alexander VI had divided the world into two and told the Portuguese that this half of the world is yours, and the Spanish, the other half of the world is yours. So it's funny. So Brazil was part of this Portuguese. No, so they were told to go convert people, and in Latin America, of course, massive force was used, and certainly in the Philippines, and in many other parts, there was clearly force used. It was not
peaceful, not entirely peaceful.
It was not all benign stuff,
right.
But lots of techniques of conversion, such as making the new religion sound very similar to the existing belief system.
Digestion
is the main way in which conversions happen.
Right. Subrotoji, are you available? I'm requesting the president of IHAR, Dr. Subroto Gangopadhyay, to say a few words.
So thank you, Prasenjit K, for this guided historical tour that you led us into our neighboring countries and focused on Asia. And Asia constitutes almost 60% of the world. And we are yet to even talk about the Levant, the Middle East, Persia, crossing over to the Mediterranean, the influence, in Greece and Rome, and you went up to Hawaii. And it is somewhat sad that as Indians, we have not focused on 60% of the world where our influence is very clear. And as you mentioned, James Mill, who wrote The History of British India in 1817, actually never visited India. And here is a quote unquote self-claiming amateur historian who travels with the camera and goes to every region, and not only does a phenomenal historical research, but chronicles it through his camera, through his travelogues, and makes history come alive. So it doesn't speak volumes about our intellectual tradition, which is being transmitted in the halls of our academia through people sitting in their rooms and building on narratives of people who have never even visited the country. And that indeed is what we feel is, a responsibility as Indians we have to perhaps lend our efforts to build a narrative that is wider, all-encompassing, and looks at many aspects of culture and many aspects of language, history, and so on and so forth. And we are glad to see that you are certainly an exemplar in inspiring us to widen our worldview. We have been focused too much on seeking validation of 750 million Europeans and perhaps 350 million North Americans that constitute less than 15% of the population. We've forgotten the 1.2 billion Africans. We've forgotten the 4.8, 4.6 billion Asians. And we've forgotten that we are in ipso facto the world. If one were to espouse a democratic world, or a world that is truly representative of people. So we owe a great deal of gratitude to you for having focused on this. I personally warmly again welcome you for joining IHAR. And I think you will perhaps lead to a stream within our scholars that will focus on the areas that you've talked about, not only for historical reasons, but also, as you said, for a very essential component of our current geopolitics that is very important, that has been emphasized to some extent by our government. And thank you so much for this illuminating talk. There are many more, I think, that will be needed in the series to perhaps focus on one region, because there is so much data and so many aspects to history that you bring about. And this also inspires all of the people in the group to read your book before we get into perhaps the individual topical subjects, so that you have inspired us all to read your book. We will. And I'm sure we will continue our series of dialogues in future, personally and through this forum. Thank everybody who joined. Sahanaji, thank you for wonderfully conducting this. And for all our scholars, please feel free to reach Prasenjit Ji through his private communications for questions. And yes, I assert that people outside the academic domains of history do have a role, and a legitimate role, and a legitimate business to contribute to historical knowledge, as of any stream of knowledge which should be contributed to by any interested outsider or insider. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Subrata ji. And so we come to the end of this lovely session. I'd like to thank all the viewers who joined in, and especially thanks to Prasenjit for opening our eyes to so many things that we weren't aware of. We'll keep this conversation going. A recording of this will be put on YouTube, and we'll have comments there coming in. And of course, there are various ways to converse and have discussions to move forward. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy in these COVID times.